Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Today I'd like to talk to you about the important topic of socialization and homeschooling. Socialization is an important concern many parents have about homeschooling. Parents rightfully worry that by withdrawing their kids from schools, their kids would then be deprived of the opportunity to meet with and socialize with other kids and adults. In fact, before the pandemic, I myself never seriously thought about homeschooling my own children. Like most parents, I recognize that socialization and having the opportunity to meet and interact with and play with other kids is an important part of growing up. But the irony now is that because of the pandemic and because of school closures, homeschoolers in many instances now get more socialization than kids enrolled in schools. And today, I'd like to explore the topic of socialization in both the pre- and the post-pandemic world. First, let's start with a definition of socialization. Here's a definition I found from Merriam-Webster's dictionaries. Socialization is, quote, the process beginning during childhood by which individuals acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of a society. Now, I was a little surprised at first when I read this definition. I had assumed that a definition of socialization would revolve around meeting other people. But notice in this definition that being around other people is not the goal. Instead, the goal of socialization is, quote, to acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of a society. And this makes sense when you come to think about it. The goal of any school in general is to help prepare our kids for life as adults. That's why our schools need to teach our kids how to read, write, and do arithmetic. We also all strive to teach them common values, habits, and attitudes so that when they do grow up, they will be able to live, work, and interact as healthy members of society. So that's why socialization is very important. Kids do need to interact with other people to acquire these values, habits, and attitudes. Not just with other kids, but with other adults as well. And schools have always played a central role in the socialization of our children. But then the pandemic came and everything changed. Schools were forced to close, and when some campuses did reopen, they did so with strict social distancing requirements. Socialization has become much harder for everyone, whether you were a homeschooler or not. And the irony is that homeschoolers now, in many instances, get more socialization than many public school kids. Let me explain. You see, I used to have the stereotypical image of homeschooling as a parent sitting at their kitchen table alone with their child, isolated from hundreds of school kids learning and playing together in a neighborhood school. And whenever this homeschool child went out to the real world and encountered other people, they tended to be socially awkward compared to normal school children. Now, this stereotype may in fact have been true for many homeschooling kids back in a time when homeschooling wasn't very common. And it was back then it was much harder for them to find other homeschoolers in their neighborhood with whom they could socialize with. But the pandemic has changed everything. When schools were forced to close back in March 2020, it forced every family, whether they were ready to or not, to become homeschoolers. And many families remained homeschoolers even when schools reopened in the fall. A lot of families simply decided that attending regular schools through remote learning or with strict social distancing requirements simply wasn't right for their child, and they decided to stick with homeschooling. What this meant was, it is now easier than ever for homeschoolers to find other homeschooling families with whom they could work with and form learning pods. In these learning pods, small groups of homeschooling families can regularly meet together to make and take turns teaching different subjects. These learning paths also give kids an excellent opportunity to meet in person and socialize and learn and play together. In my case, my family has formed a learning pod with 2 other families in our neighborhood. We meet at least 3 or 4 times a week where each adult takes turns teaching different subjects like language arts, math, history, and computer programming. But perhaps just as importantly, these learning pods have given our kids an opportunity to meet with and to learn and to socialize with other kids in person. Now, I do realize that socializing with a few kids in a small learning pod is definitely not the same as being on a campus with hundreds of kids. But in my opinion, it's still a lot better than remote learning and trying to socialize with other kids over a computer screen. Now that said, we will all have a choice to make when the pandemic is over and schools fully reopen without social distancing requirements. And the main advantage I feel schools have when it comes to socialization is diversity. On a school campus, you have much more opportunities to meet more people and interact with other kids from different backgrounds, some of whom you may not easily get along with. And that, I believe, is also an important part of socialization. So if you're a homeschooling parent who values diversity in your child's socialization, then you will have a choice to make, or at least you will need to be more proactive in trying to put your child in situations where they will have the opportunity to meet more kids from different backgrounds. But let's not forget that sometimes there can also be a downside to socialization in the schools. If your child is a little different from other kids, perhaps in the way they look or the way they behave, or if they happen to be a lot smarter or a little bit slower than other kids, there's always a possibility that they can be bullied in the schoolyard. Unfortunately, kids sometimes can be just as mean as adults, and bullying in the schoolyard has always been a problem. Kids can also be exposed to extreme peer pressure in schools, where they are sometimes expected to behave and act in certain ways that may not be beneficial for them. Now, I'm not a parent who believes that kids should be completely isolated from any negative influence. After all, part of growing up is learning how to handle adversity and difficult social situations with other people. But if your child is a little different from everyone else, the possibility of bullying and peer pressure can be very real, and it's something every parent should consider when weighing the benefits of socialization in the schools. And as we look towards a post-pandemic world, we will have to continually rethink what exactly does it mean to socialize. What does it mean to acquire the values, habits, and attitudes of a post-pandemic society? I know that for my family, we plan to continue to expand the socialization of our kids by returning them to various classes in our community as soon as restrictions are lifted and when it's safe. Before the pandemic, my kids were attending sports classes at our local gym where they learned classes like ballet, dance, tennis, and soccer. They also took after-school art classes and Saturday morning math class. All of these classes gave them opportunities to socialize and meet with other people. And we look forward to returning them to these classes again so they can meet and play with more kids when it's safe for everyone. I also predict that in a post-pandemic world, there will be a lot more opportunities than ever to socialize outside the schoolyard. I expect local gyms, places of worship, and learning centers will all be providing programs for parents and kids eager and hungry to socialize after a long pandemic. The pandemic is and will continue to end up changing the values, habits, and attitudes of our entire society. And with that, we as parents have to adapt and sometimes rethink what it means to properly socialize our kids. So if you're a parent who's concerned about the proper socialization of your child, always remember that socialization doesn't begin or end in a school. It begins in the home and continues throughout life. And with more families turning to homeschooling today, homeschooling now can offer parents more options than ever in how they want to help their kids socialize and properly acquire the right values, habits, and attitudes they need for a fast-changing society. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.